April 29th, 1945. Stalag 9C prisoner holding area near Siegenhain, Germany. The air smells of wet wool and disinfectant. No one had prepared them for this reversal. Not the Reich's propaganda ministry, not the officers who had sworn the fatherland would never fall, and certainly not the women who had worn uniforms just days earlier. Women who now stood behind barbed wire, waiting to discover what vengeance looked like when it came wearing an American flag on its shoulder. They had heard the stories. They knew what happened to the defeated. They braced themselves for what seemed inevitable. But when the guard finally approached, when that young man from Kansas or Ohio or someplace they couldn't pronounce reached toward one shivering woman in a torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, something happened that would haunt her memory for the next 60 years. Something so simple, so unexpected, that it shattered everything she thought she knew about enemies, about war, and about the thin line between brutality and mercy. The spring of 1945 brought a flood of prisoners unlike anything the Allied forces had anticipated. As the Wehrmacht collapsed across central Germany, the captured weren't just combat soldiers. They were clerks and cooks, medics and mechanics, telegraphists and telephone operators. And among them, for the first time in significant numbers, were women. Members of the Wehrmacht's Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had operated anti-aircraft batteries, managed communications networks, and kept the German war machine functioning when men could no longer be spared from the front lines. These women had not expected to become prisoners. The Nazi ideology that had mobilized them never contemplated defeat. The training they received never included a single hour on what to do when the enemy arrived. They had been told they were essential to victory. They had been promised the Reich would protect them. Neither turned out to be true. In the chaos of Germany's final weeks, as entire army groups surrendered and command structures evaporated, thousands of these female auxiliaries found themselves caught in the Allied advance. Some tried to flee east, hoping to reach areas still under German control. Others attempted to blend into the civilian population, tearing off their uniforms and hiding their military identification papers. Most simply waited, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, as American and British columns rolled past their positions. The stories that had circulated among German troops about Allied treatment of prisoners varied wildly, but they all shared one common thread when it came to women in uniform. Expect the worst. Soviet conduct on the Eastern Front had provided brutal evidence of what happened when victorious armies encountered women who had served their enemy. The Western Allies might claim to fight by different rules, but who could trust those claims when everything else had turned out to be a lie? Gertrude Hoffmann was 23 years old when she became prisoner of war, number 31G4477. She had volunteered for the Wehrmacht's Helferinnen in 1943, motivated less by ideological fervor than by practical necessity. Her factory job in Stuttgart had been eliminated when the plant converted to underground production, and the auxiliary service offered guaranteed food rations, accommodation, and a salary that helped support her mother and younger siblings. They assigned her to a signals unit near Frankfurt, where she operated telephone switchboards connecting Wehrmacht command posts across Western Germany. The work was tedious and exhausting. 12-hour shifts spent plugging cables and routing calls, never knowing if the voices on the other end were coordinating supply deliveries or ordering men to their deaths. She told herself she was just doing a job. She told herself the politics didn't concern her. She told herself right up until the morning of March 27, 1945, when American artillery began falling on their compound and the officers disappeared, leaving the women to fend for themselves. For 3 days, Gertrude and 17 other women from her unit hid in a basement as the battle moved around them. They had no orders, no information, and diminishing hope. The sounds of combat gradually faded, replaced by the rumble of heavy vehicles and voices speaking English. When American soldiers finally discovered their hiding place, Gertrude's first instinct was to recoil. She had pulled her field jacket tight around her body and pressed herself against the cold stone wall, every muscle tensed. The soldiers, boys really, none of them looking older than 25, had seemed more surprised than threatening. One of them, a sergeant with a thick Southern accent she couldn't begin to understand, had radioed for instructions. They waited. The women didn't move. Everyone seemed uncertain about what happened next. She didn't notice the guard approaching until he was less than 10 feet away. Private Kendrick had been making his rounds, checking the perimeter, when he spotted the solitary figure pacing near the fence. Even in the dim light from the camp's scattered floodlights, he could see she was shivering violently. He had seen plenty of cold soldiers during the winter campaign, had been one himself during the push through the Ardennes, and he recognized the signs of someone losing the battle against hypothermia. The woman's movement had the jerky, uncoordinated quality of muscles that were shutting down. If she stayed out in this temperature without better protection, she would be in medical trouble by morning. Kendrick made a decision that would later appear in neither his official report nor his service record, because it was simultaneously too small to matter and too complicated to explain. He walked to the nearby guard station, retrieved one of the spare wool blankets issued to sentries for overnight duty, and approached the fence line where the woman was pacing. He called out to her in his limited German, a handful of words picked up from phrase books and captured prisoners. "Kommen Sie here. Come here." Gertrude froze. Her first instinct was pure animal fear. A male guard, approaching alone, calling her over in the darkness. She had heard the whispered stories that circulated among the female prisoners. Tales that were part experience, part rumor, part collective anxiety. She knew what happened when guards singled women out. She knew what that call in the darkness usually meant. Her entire body wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was behind barbed wire. He had a rifle. Running would only make it worse. She felt her breathing accelerate, felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt every survival instinct screaming, conflicting instructions. Kendrick saw her fear. He had spent enough time in classrooms reading young faces to recognize terror when he saw it. He stopped walking forward. He held up one hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-threat, and with his other hand, he held out the blanket, shaking it slightly so she could see what it was. "Blanket," he said in English, then tried the German word he thought might be right. Decke, cold, sigh, cold. His linguistic skills were failing him, but he hoped the gesture would communicate what words couldn't. Gertrude stared. The guard wasn't advancing. He was standing still, several feet from the fence, holding out a thick wool blanket. Her mind struggled to process this information. It didn't match any scenario she had prepared for. What did he want? What was the cost? There was always a cost. Nothing came without a price, especially not from your captors. She opened her mouth to refuse, to say something that would make him leave, but all that came out was a whisper in German. "Was wollen Sie? What do you want?" Kendrick didn't catch the exact words, but he understood the question. What struck him in that moment, what he would later try and fail to adequately explain to Sarah in letters home, was how young she looked, how scared, how much she reminded him of the 16-year-old girl in his third period English class back in Topeka. The one who had flinched every time anyone raised their voice because her father came home drunk most nights. The same wide-eyed fear, the same defensive posture, the same terrible anticipation of violence. It made something twist in his chest. He did the only thing he could think of. He stepped backward, deliberately, visibly, creating distance. Then he slowly placed the blanket on the ground, midway between himself and the fence. He pointed to it, then to her, then took another step back. "For you," he said. "Just for you." He made a wrapping gesture around his own shoulders, mimicking someone putting on a blanket. Then he turned and walked away. Didn't wait for her response. Didn't linger. Just left the blanket lying there in the dirt and returned to his patrol route. For several long seconds, Gertrude couldn't move. She watched the guard's retreating figure, watched until he disappeared around the corner of a storage building. Her mind kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to come back, for the trap to spring. But he didn't return. The blanket just lay there in a crumpled heap. Other prisoners had noticed now. A woman named Ilse, who had been an anti-aircraft auxiliary near Bremen, walked over slowly. "What did he want?" she whispered. Gertrude shook her head. "I don't know. He left a blanket." Ilse stared at it like it might be poison. "Don't touch it. It's a trick." But Gertrude was already moving. The cold had made the decision for her. She reached through the fence. The gaps were wide enough, and dragged the blanket through. It was heavy, thick, warm with residual heat from wherever it had been stored. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the difference was immediate. The wool was coarse against her neck, but it blocked the wind. It held her body heat. For the first time in 5 days, she stopped shivering. The documents that survived from that period tell us that this kind of interaction was far more common than wartime propaganda suggested, yet far less common than post-war revisionism claimed. The historical record shows neither universal brutality nor universal compassion. It shows human beings under extraordinary pressure, making individual choices that range from monstrous to merciful, often in the same camp, sometimes on the same day. The official policy of the United States Army regarding treatment of prisoners of war was clear and generally well enforced. Prisoners were to be provided adequate food, shelter, and medical care. They were to be protected from violence. They were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, regardless of their nationality or their Army's conduct. In practice, enforcement varied wildly depending on commanders, circumstances, and the temperament of individual soldiers. Some camps developed reputations for harsh conditions and indifferent guards. Others, like the facility near Ziegenhain, maintained standards that surprised prisoners who arrived expecting revenge. What the German women didn't understand, what they couldn't understand given the information they had been fed for 12 years, was that the American military indoctrination had emphasized repeatedly that professional soldiers didn't take vengeance on defeated enemies. The U.S. Army's orientation films, the training lectures, the command guidance all stressed that Americans fought for principles, not blood. Mistreating prisoners wasn't just morally wrong, it was un-American. It was the kind of thing the enemy did. The propaganda was partly genuine belief, partly pragmatic calculation. Armies that treated prisoners well encouraged more surrenders, but its effect was real. Most American soldiers genuinely believed they represented something better than their adversaries, and that belief shaped behavior more often than not. Private Kendrick checked on the women's section twice more that night. Each time he saw the small figure wrapped in his spare blanket, now sitting with a group of other women. They were sharing the warmth, taking turns under its coverage. He felt a small, private satisfaction at that. It was such a minor thing in the vast machinery of war. One blanket, one cold night. But minor things were all he had control over. He couldn't end the war. He couldn't rebuild bombed cities or resurrect the dead. He couldn't erase the atrocities that had brought them all to this point. But he could make sure one freezing woman had a blanket. That was something. That was within his power. Gertrude didn't sleep that night, but not because of the cold. The blanket had solved that problem. Instead, she lay awake trying to reconcile what had happened with everything she thought she understood about this situation. The guard had approached her. She had been terrified. And then, nothing. No demand. No violence. No price extracted. Just a blanket and a retreat. It violated the logic she had been operating under since the moment of capture. That logic said, "You are now property. You will be used. Resistance will be punished. Submission will be tolerated." It was the logic of power, the logic she had seen applied to forced laborers and occupied populations, the logic that seemed universal in wartime. But if that logic was wrong, if there were men who didn't follow it even when they had every opportunity and legal right, then what else was wrong? What other foundational assumptions were built on lies? The questions multiplied through the night. She thought about the propaganda films she had watched during her auxiliary training, films that portrayed Allied soldiers as barbaric mongrels who respected nothing, destroyed everything, and treated women as spoils of war. She thought about the whispered stories from the Eastern Front, stories of Soviet behavior that gave those propaganda films credibility. She thought about her own military service, about the refugees she had seen herded through transit camps, about the foreign workers who had staffed the factory before she joined the Wehrmacht, about how they had been treated, about what that treatment said about her country and her people. None of those thoughts were comfortable. None of them had easy answers. In the morning, during the breakfast distribution, a thin porridge made from cornmeal and powdered milk, Gertrude looked for the guard who had given her the blanket. She wanted to return it, thought that was the proper thing to do. She spotted him across the compound, talking with another soldier near the main gate. When their eyes met, she raised her hand in a small, tentative wave. Kendrick nodded in acknowledgement but didn't approach. That restraint was deliberate. He had learned from the camp commander that maintaining professional distance was crucial. Fraternization created problems. Jealousy among other prisoners. Suspicion from other guards. Complications if accusations arose. The blanket had been about basic human decency, not about establishing a relationship. He had done his duty as he understood it. Now he would maintain appropriate boundaries. What do you do with unexpected mercy from an enemy? That question had no easy answer in 1945 Germany. The Nazi ideology had been built on rigid categories. Us and them, strong and weak, master race, and Untermensch. Those categories required the enemy to be consistently evil, consistently other. When individual enemies turned out to be complicated human beings capable of both violence and kindness, the categories began to crack. And once they cracked, questions could seep through. Questions like, if we were lied to about this, what else was a lie? If the enemy isn't what we were told, who are we? If our cause wasn't righteous, what was our service for? Gertrude began writing these questions in a small notebook she had been given by camp administration, part of an effort to allow prisoners to maintain minimal personal records. The notebook was supposed to be for practical matters, dates, names, messages to be conveyed to families. Instead, Gertrude filled it with observations and philosophical wrestling. May 3, 1945. The American guard who gave me the blanket was on duty again today. I tried to thank him in German. He didn't understand the words, but he smiled and nodded. He has a kind face. This troubles me. I don't know what to do with a kind enemy. How do you reconcile kindness with conquest? How do you maintain hate in the face of decency? The notebook survived. Gertrude kept it through the remainder of her captivity, through the chaos of post-war Germany, through her eventual marriage to a mechanic from Hamburg, and the rebuilding of ordinary life. She kept it in a drawer, rarely looking at it, never showing it to anyone. It surfaced only after her death in 2008, when her daughter discovered it while sorting through her mother's possessions. The daughter donated it to a local historical society, which recognized its significance and eventually shared it with researchers studying the transformation of German society after 1945. Those pages provide a remarkable window into the psychological process that millions of Germans underwent. The painful dismantling of certainty, the grudging acknowledgement of having been deceived, and the difficult work of constructing a new understanding of self and nation. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. News reached the POW camp within hours. The reaction among the female prisoners was complex and varied. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Some erupted in anger, railing against the generals who had betrayed them, the Führer who had abandoned them, the Allies who had stabbed Germany in the back. Any explanation that preserved some shred of the old certainty. Gertrude felt primarily relief. Relief that the killing would stop. Relief that her mother and siblings might survive after all. Relief that she wouldn't have to spend years in captivity wondering if the war would ever end. But underneath the relief was something darker, the beginning of shame. Not shame for having served exactly, but shame for not having questioned. Shame for having accepted the easy answers and the comfortable lies. Shame for having needed an enemy to show her basic humanity before she questioned whether her side was human at all. Private Kendrick didn't see the war's end as a dramatic moment. For him, it was more like the final exhalation of something that had been dying for months. The shooting would stop. The dying would stop. He would eventually go home to Kansas and to Sarah and to the child he hadn't yet met. That was enough. On the evening of May 7th, during his guard rotation, he passed near the women's compound and saw Gertrude standing by the fence. She was holding the wool blanket. She had kept it, had somehow managed to retain it as personal property. And when she saw him, she folded it carefully and set it on a fence post near the gate. Then she stepped back and said something in German he didn't understand. She pressed her hand to her heart, then extended it toward him in a gesture that needed no translation. "Thank you, I see you. You mattered." She married in 1949. Her husband Klaus had been a Wehrmacht infantryman captured by the British in Normandy. He had spent 2 years in a POW camp in England and spoke of similar experiences. Guards who were professional rather than vengeful. Treatment that was correct if not comfortable. And the strange cognitive dissonance of being shown decency by people you had been trained to hate. They didn't talk about the war often. That wasn't unusual for their generation. But occasionally, late at night, they would share fragments of memory, trying to make sense of what they had lived through. I think about the guard who gave me a blanket, Gertrude said once. I think about how easy it would have been for him to not do that, how he gained nothing from being kind. And I wonder how many small kindnesses happened during the war that nobody recorded, that just disappeared into history. I wonder if those moments mattered as much as the battles and the treaties. Klaus considered that. They mattered to you, he said finally. That has to count for something. Did it count? That's the question historians struggle with when examining this period. The grand narratives of World War II focus on military campaigns, political decisions, and ideological conflict. The micro-histories, the individual encounters between enemies, the small choices that accumulated into cultural transformation, are harder to measure and easier to dismiss as sentimentality. But the documentary evidence suggests they were crucial. The speed with which West Germany transformed from a Nazi state to a stable democracy remains one of the most remarkable political transitions of the 20th century. That transition required more than constitutional engineering and economic recovery. It required a psychological shift, a willingness among millions of Germans to question their previous beliefs and embrace new values. And that shift was enabled, at least in part, by the accumulated experiences of encountering enemies who didn't match the propaganda caricatures, who demonstrated through their actions that another way of being was possible. Private James Kendrick returned to Kansas in November 1945. He resumed teaching, raised his family, and rarely spoke about the war. When he did mention his service, it was usually in the context of general reminiscences about his unit or the places he had seen. He never specifically mentioned the incident with the blanket. Why would he? From his perspective, it was a trivial moment. He had given a cold woman a blanket. It took 30 seconds and cost him nothing. Compared to the enormous events he had witnessed, it barely registered as worth remembering. He didn't know that the woman had kept his blanket for weeks, that she had written about the experience, that it had become for her a symbol of something larger than the gesture itself. He didn't know until 1987, when a letter arrived at his home in Topeka. The letter was from Germany, forwarded through the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was written in careful English, clearly composed with the help of a dictionary. Dear Private Kendrick, it began, you will not remember me. In April 1945, I was a prisoner of war at the camp near Ziegenhain, Germany. You were a guard. One cold evening, you gave me a blanket when I was freezing. You stepped back when I was afraid, and you expected nothing in return. I have thought about that moment many times over the past 42 years. I am writing now because I am old, and I wanted you to know that your small kindness mattered. It was a crack in the wall that let in light. Thank you. Gertrude Hoffman Schmidt. Kendrick read the letter 3 times. He had to reach back through 42 years of memory to even recall the incident. When he finally did, a vague recollection of a shivering woman by a fence, a blanket, a cold night, he was stunned that anyone would remember it, much less write about it decades later. He showed the letter to his wife, Sarah, who had heard countless war stories over the years, but never this one. You never mentioned this, she said. He shrugged. It was just a blanket. I didn't think it was important. Sarah looked at the letter again, at the careful handwriting, at the obvious effort that had gone into composing it in a foreign language. It was important to her, she said. Maybe that's what matters, Kendrick wrote back. The correspondence continued sporadically until his death in 1994. They never met in person, never had a deep friendship, but the letters maintained a connection that both found meaningful in ways they struggled to articulate. Gertrude told him about post-war Germany, about the process of rebuilding and reckoning with history, about her children and grandchildren who grew up in a country that bore little resemblance to the one she had served. Kendrick told her about his teaching career, about the students he had tried to help understand World War II without reducing it to simple good versus evil narratives, about his belief that ordinary people making decent choices were what held civilization together when institutions failed. Their correspondence was preserved by their families after their deaths and eventually donated to the National World War II Museum, where it resides now as a small but significant part of the historical record. The story of Gertrude Hoffman and James Kendrick is not unique. Similar encounters played out in dozens of POW camps across Germany in the spring of 1945. Female prisoners met guards who treated them with professional distance rather than predatory interest. Male prisoners encountered captors who provided adequate care rather than revenge. Civilians met occupying soldiers who were more interested in chocolate and coffee than violence and exploitation. Each encounter was small, each contradicted the propaganda, and collectively, they created the psychological conditions for transformation. This is not to romanticize the occupation or ignore the very real problems that occurred. There were assaults, there were injustices, there were failures of discipline and humanity. The historical record contains all of that alongside the moments of decency. But the ratio mattered. The fact that decent treatment was common enough to seem normal rather than exceptional enough to seem miraculous changed how Germans understood their defeat and their future. By the 1950s, Gertrude had become involved in local reconciliation efforts. She worked with church groups organizing exchanges between German and American young people, trying to build connections that would prevent future wars. She spoke occasionally at schools about her experiences, though she was always careful and selective about what she shared. German society was still wrestling with how to discuss the Nazi period. Too much honesty risked overwhelming guilt. Too much silence risked forgetting and repetition. She tried to navigate that tension by focusing on the human dimensions rather than the political ones. "I was a prisoner of war," she would tell students. "I was afraid. I expected the worst. And an enemy soldier gave me a blanket and asked nothing in return. That taught me something about the capacity for goodness, even in terrible circumstances. That's what I want you to remember." Some students understood. Some didn't. Some accused her of downplaying German crimes by focusing on Allied kindness. Some accused her of being naive about power dynamics and the realities of occupation. She accepted the criticism without much defensiveness. "I'm not trying to write the definitive history of the war," she would respond. "I'm just telling you what happened to me and what it meant. You can decide what to do with that." It was a modest approach, but modesty had become her default. She had learned painfully that certainty was dangerous. Better to offer experience and let others draw conclusions than to insist on a single interpretation. The blanket itself didn't survive. Gertrude kept it for several years after the war, but practical necessity eventually overcame sentimental attachment. The wool was good quality, and in the immediate post-war years, good wool was valuable. She repurposed it into winter clothing for her children: a cap, mittens, a patch on a coat. The physical object was consumed by the needs of daily survival, but the memory remained crystalline and precise, untouched by time's usual erosion. She could recall the texture of the wool, the weight of it around her shoulders, the sound of the guard's footsteps retreating, the overwhelming relief and confusion she had felt. The memory had been reinforced by repeated reflection, had become almost mythologized in her own mind. She was aware of that mythologization, aware that memory and meaning had become intertwined, but she didn't try to untangle them. The truth of what happened and the truth of what it meant to her had merged into a single narrative that shaped the rest of her life. When Gertrude died in 2008 at the age of 86, her obituary made no mention of her Wehrmacht service or her time as a prisoner of war. Those weren't the parts of her life her family wanted to emphasize. Instead, they focused on her decades of reconciliation work, her 4 children and 11 grandchildren, her involvement in the church community, her love of gardening. The private Gertrude, the one who had written in her diary about kind enemies and the collapse of certainty, remained largely hidden. Only after her daughter discovered the diary and donated it to historians did that interior narrative become part of the public record. And with it came the letter from James Kendrick, carefully preserved in a folder marked Important Keep. The historians who studied these documents in the following years were struck by how much they revealed about the psychological dimensions of post-war transformation. Political scientists and economists had thoroughly analyzed the structural factors that enabled Germany's democratization. But the interior journey, the process by which individuals dismantled their ideological certainty and rebuilt their understanding of the world, remained less well documented. Gertrude's diary and correspondence provided a rare window into that process. They showed how doubt could be seeded by small contradictions, how ideology could crack when reality refused to conform, how people could change when given space and reason to change. The documents were incorporated into exhibitions about the occupation period, quoted in academic papers, and referenced in textbooks trying to help students understand not just what happened in post-war Germany, but how it happened. James Kendrick never achieved anything resembling fame or historical significance. His obituary in the Topeka Capital Journal ran 6 column inches and noted his military service in a single sentence. He would have been entirely lost to history except for the accident of a German woman keeping a diary and a letter surviving in a file folder. But that accident matters. It reminds us that history isn't made solely by generals and politicians making grand decisions. It's also made by school teachers from Kansas making small choices in the moment, choices to step back instead of forward, to offer warmth instead of taking advantage, to see a frightened human being instead of an enemy to be conquered. Those choices don't appear in military histories or political analyses. They're too small, too personal, too undramatic, but they accumulate. They create the conditions in which larger changes become possible. They matter. The question of how to remember World War II has become increasingly fraught as the generation that fought it passes away. We're losing the living witnesses, the people who can say, "I was there, this is what happened, this is what it was like." In their absence, we're left with documents, artifacts, and recorded testimonies, the fragmentary remains from which we try to reconstruct understanding. And increasingly, we're faced with competing narratives about what the war meant, what lessons we should draw, what it tells us about human nature and political systems, and the possibility of moral action in immoral circumstances. The grand narratives are easier to work with. Democracy versus fascism, good versus evil, the righteous struggle against tyranny. But the small stories, the ones like Gertrude and James, complicate those narratives in productive ways. They remind us that human beings are more complex than ideological categories allow, that enemies can become something else, that decency can survive even in the machinery of industrial warfare. 79 years after that cold April evening in 1945, we're still finding pieces of these stories, still discovering diaries in attic boxes, still conducting interviews with the last survivors, still trying to understand what happened and what it means. The facts are clear enough. Germany started a war of aggression, committed horrific atrocities, was defeated and occupied, and transformed into a democratic society. But the mechanisms of that transformation, the interior processes by which millions of individuals change their understanding of themselves and their world, remain partially obscured. We catch glimpses in documents like Gertrude's diary. We see fragments in letters like the ones she exchanged with James. We piece together a picture that is necessarily incomplete, but crucially important. Because the question of how people change matters beyond historical curiosity. It matters now, in our present moment, when we face the challenge of transforming hatred into coexistence, of bridging divides that seem unbridgeable, of finding common humanity across political and cultural differences that feel insurmountable. The story of a German prisoner and an American guard tells us that such transformation is possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, not universal, but possible. It tells us that small gestures of decency can create openings for larger changes. It tells us that treating people with dignity, even when they're powerless and you have every excuse not to, can matter in ways that ripple forward through time. It tells us that stepping back, offering a blanket, and asking nothing in return might be one of the most powerful political acts available to ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances. The blanket is gone. The people are gone. The camp is gone, bulldozed in 1946, now a residential neighborhood where children play, and no marker indicates what once stood there. But the story persists, preserved in documents and now in digital archives where it will outlast the paper it was originally written on. It persists because it touches something fundamental about what we want to believe about ourselves, that we're capable of decency even in dark times, that we can choose mercy when vengeance would be easier, that the better angels of our nature can prevail if we give them space to act. Whether that belief is justified, whether human nature really contains that capacity for goodness, or we're just projecting hopeful fantasies onto ambiguous evidence, remains an open question. But the story of Gertrude Hoffman and James Kendrick suggests that sometimes, in specific moments, under particular circumstances, ordinary people do extraordinary things by the simple expedient of treating other human beings like human beings. That's not a triumphant conclusion. It's not particularly uplifting or dramatic. It won't make a good movie because there's no climax, no confrontation, no moment of cathartic resolution. It's just a small story about a small kindness that mattered to the people involved and might, if we let it, teach us something about how change happens and why decency matters even when it seems futile, especially when it seems futile. Because if a blanket given on a cold night in April 1945 could contribute, even infinitesimally, to the transformation of an entire society, then perhaps our own small choices matter more than we think. Perhaps the way we treat the people who are vulnerable to us, the people we have power over, the people we're told are enemies, perhaps that matters not just morally but historically. Perhaps that's how worlds change, one blanket at a time. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes, and some echoes demand we listen. The war that shaped our modern world ended 8 decades ago, but its lessons remain urgent. The question of how we treat the defeated, how we bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides, how we choose mercy over vengeance. These aren't historical abstractions. They're present dilemmas. And sometimes the answer is as simple and as difficult as stepping back, offering warmth, and asking nothing in return. Subscribe to continue this journey through the human dimensions of history's darkest hours.